On a rainy afternoon in Manchester, a long queue of frustrated passengers stood waiting at the ticket counter of British Airways. The airport was buzzing with the usual Friday rush when Margaret Thompson walked briskly past the check-in desks. Her black uniform jacket was perfectly pressed, and her silver name badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. At 52, Margaret carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent 15 years dealing with everything from lost luggage to emergency landings. Today, though, felt different somehow. Flight 747 to Miami was scheduled to leave. At 7 o'clock that evening, Margaret had already checked the passenger list during her morning rounds. The plane was packed with holidaymakers and business travelers, all eager to escape the British weather for the sunshine of Florida. But just before 6, while passengers were gathering at Gate 12, the maintenance team made a discovery that would change everything. James Wilson, the senior maintenance engineer, appeared beside Margaret as she reviewed boarding passes. His weathered face looked worried as he held up a clipboard filled with technical notes. "We found something unusual during the pre-flight check," he said quietly. "The hydraulic system is showing irregular pressure readings. It might be nothing, but we need more time to be sure." Margaret nodded, already calculating the implications. Delays always created problems, but safety could never be compromised. She picked up the microphone at the gate and faced the waiting passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have an important announcement about Flight 747 to Miami. Due to necessary maintenance checks, we will experience a delay. Our maintenance team needs to thoroughly inspect the aircraft to ensure your safety." The mood in the terminal shifted immediately. Phones came out as people checked their connections. Business cards were shuffled as travelers calculated missed appointments. Margaret could see the frustration building in people's faces, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Thomas Crawford pushed through the crowd with the determination of someone used to getting his way. His expensive suit was immaculate, and his designer briefcase spoke of success and importance. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he declared, his voice carrying across the terminal. "I have a crucial dinner meeting in Miami tonight. Partners. Flying in from New York. This delay could cost my company thousands." Margaret recognized the type immediately, the passenger who believed rules applied to everyone except them. She maintained her professional smile. "I understand your concern, Mr. Crawford. However, the maintenance issue requires our immediate attention. Safety must come first." "Safety?" Thomas scoffed. "You people always use that excuse. First, it's the baggage handlers causing delays. Then it's weather in some distant city. Now it's maintenance. Maybe if this airline hired more competent staff, we wouldn't have these constant problems." The words hit Margaret like ice water. Around her, other passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some continued recording on their phones, while others pretended to be absorbed in their devices. The implication in Thomas's words was unmistakable to everyone present. "Sir," Margaret replied, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor she felt. "Inside, I assure you that every member of our ground operations team is highly qualified. This maintenance check is a standard safety procedure that could prevent a serious problem during flight." Thomas's face reddened further. "Standard procedure? I fly every week, and this kind of thing only seems to happen when certain people are in charge." He looked pointedly at Margaret's name badge before continuing. "I demand to speak to your supervisor, someone who actually knows how to run an efficient operation." Two security guards in crisp uniforms appeared at the edges of the crowd, having noticed the escalating situation. Other passengers began murmuring. A young mother nearby hugged her children closer, while an elderly couple exchanged worried glances. The tension in the terminal was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret felt the sting of tears threatening, but refused to let them show. In her 15 years of service, she had earned countless commendations for excellence. She had managed crisis situations that others had praised as masterful. Yet here she stood, her authority questioned publicly in a way that cut deeper than any professional criticism. "I'll call my supervisor for you, Mr. Crawford," she said, reaching for her radio. "But I want to assure all passengers that this delay is purely precautionary. Your safety is worth more than any inconvenience we might experience tonight." As she waited for David Peterson to arrive, Margaret thought about all the times she had guided passengers through emergencies, the reassurance she'd offered to nervous flyers. The extra mile she'd gone to accommodate families with special needs, all the positive feedback letters she'd received over the years. Yet one angry passenger could make her question her entire career with just a few carefully chosen words. The end. The two security guards, William and Sarah, approached the situation with practiced calm. They recognized Margaret from countless shifts and knew her reputation for handling difficult passengers with grace. Today, though, something felt different about this confrontation. David Peterson arrived at Gate 12 within 3 minutes of Margaret's call. He walked quickly across the terminal floor, his manager's badge swinging from its lanyard. David had worked with Margaret for 8 years, ever since she'd transferred from Birmingham Airport. In that time, they'd weathered storm delays together, managed equipment failures as a team, and even laughed about difficult passengers over coffee in the break room. "What seems to be the problem here?" David asked, his voice taking on the diplomatic tone he reserved for upset customers. Without turning to Margaret, he addressed Thomas Crawford directly. "I'm David Peterson, the terminal manager. How can I help you today?" Margaret felt a chill run through her body. David wasn't even acknowledging her presence or asking for her side of the story. "Your supervisor doesn't understand basic customer service," Thomas declared, his voice carrying throughout the gate area. "She's caused this flight delay with some made-up maintenance issue. I have millions of dollars in business deals at stake tonight in Miami." David glanced briefly at Margaret, then turned back to Thomas. "Mr. Crawford, I'm terribly sorry for any inconvenience. Please explain what happened, and I'll do everything in my power to resolve this situation. We've been delayed for, 30 minutes already? 40? And this woman keeps talking about safety concerns when what we really need is to get in." "The air!" Thomas's gestures grew more dramatic with each word. "I've been flying for 20 years and I've never seen such incompetence." Margaret opened her mouth to explain the specific maintenance concerns James had discovered, but David cut her off with a raised hand. "Margaret, perhaps it would be best if I handle this situation directly. Why don't you take your scheduled break? I'm sure you could use a cup of tea." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. In all their years working together, David had never dismissed her so publicly. Her stomach twisted into knots as the realization sank in. He was choosing appeasement over support, customer satisfaction, over professional backing. "Sir, I explained to the passengers about the hydraulic system irregularities," Margaret managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "James from maintenance specifically requested more time to run diagnostics. It's a legitimate safety concern." David barely looked at her. "I'm sure you're right about the procedures, Margaret, but right now I need to focus on our passengers' immediate concerns. Please, take your break." The dismissal was gentle but unmistakable. Margaret nodded stiffly, avoiding eye contact with the security guards who had witnessed her humiliation. As she turned to leave, she caught snippets of David's conversation with Thomas. "I completely understand your frustration. We absolutely value your business. I'll personally make sure this is resolved quickly." The walk to the break room felt endless. Margaret's feet moved automatically along the familiar corridor while her mind raced. She passed other airport staff members, Mary from customer service, who offered a sympathetic nod, Peter from baggage handling, who looked away uncomfortably, and Ali from customs, who pretended to be busy with paperwork to avoid acknowledging what he'd seen. In the break room, Margaret made herself a cup of tea with shaking hands. The kettle's familiar whistle seemed to mock her as she poured the hot water over her usual Earl Grey. She sat at the corner table where she always ate her lunch, surrounded by motivational posters that now felt hollow. "Excellence in service," read one. "Your safety our priority," proclaimed another. 20 years of service to this airline. Countless early mornings and late nights, training new staff members, handling emergencies that would have overwhelmed others. Awards for customer service excellence, recommendations from grateful passengers, photos on the Employee of the Month wall. And yet, in one moment, all of that respect had evaporated like morning mist. The tea grew cold in her hands as she replayed the scene in her mind. Had she done something wrong? Should she have handled Thomas Crawford differently? Was there a word, a phrase, a gesture that might have diffused the situation before David arrived? The questions swirled like leaves in a whirlwind, each one adding to her growing doubt. Through the break-room window, she could see planes taxiing on the runway, their lights blinking against the darkening sky. Passengers hurried past, carrying suitcases and hopes for their journeys. The airport continued its endless rhythm of arrivals and departures, while Margaret sat frozen in uncertainty. Her phone buzzed with a message from James in maintenance. Found critical issues with Flight 747 hydraulics. You were right to call. For the delay. But even this validation couldn't lift the weight that had settled on her shoulders. Professional vindication meant little when personal dignity had been so publicly compromised. The end. The break-room phone rang sharply, cutting through Margaret's troubled thoughts. She hesitated before answering, wondering if it might be David. Calling to criticize her further? Margaret Thompson speaking, she said quietly. Thank God you're there. It was James from Air Traffic Control, and his voice carried an urgency she'd rarely heard in 15 years. We've got a serious situation developing. The weather radar is showing something extraordinary. A massive storm system is approaching much faster than anyone predicted. Margaret straightened in her chair, her personal turmoil instantly pushed aside. James, give me details. How fast is it moving? Margaret, it's unprecedented. The storm is moving at 70 miles per hour. We're already seeing lightning strikes, 15 miles out. The meteorological office says we're looking at a potentially catastrophic situation within the next 45 minutes. We need emergency protocols activated immediately. Her training took over like a well-rehearsed dance. Years of emergency response drills kicked in as she grabbed her notebook. I'm on my way back to the operations desk. Alert all departments. We need to prepare for immediate ground stops. She rushed out of the break room, her earlier humiliation completely forgotten. The institutional memory of countless emergencies guided her rapid steps through the terminal corridors. Other staff members noticed her quickened pace and began to sense something was wrong. As she rounded the corner near Gate 12, one of the maintenance technicians, Robert, appeared from behind a service door. His face was ashen, and he carried a bundle of papers and photographs that looked like technical documentation. Margaret, thank goodness I found you. We've completed the full inspection of Flight 747. He paused, clearly struggling to find the right words. The hydraulic system, it's worse than we initially thought. What did you find, Robert? I need specifics. Critical fluid leakage in the primary and backup systems. The seals are completely compromised. If that plane had taken off... His voice trailed off as he showed her the photographs. Pools of bright red hydraulic fluid glistened under the bright maintenance lights. The implications crashed over Margaret like a tidal wave. Her mind raced through the terrible possibilities. A Boeing 747 losing hydraulic pressure at altitude would lose all control surfaces. The pilots would have been helpless. At cruising altitude with 300 souls aboard, the outcome would have been catastrophic. She remembered Thomas Crawford's angry face, his dismissive words about safety protocols. The very delay he had complained about so bitterly had potentially prevented one of the worst aviation disasters in British history. Every passenger who had grumbled at the gate owed their continued existence to her refusal to compromise on safety. Robert, I need you to document everything. Photographs, measurements, timestamps. Has the manufacturer been notified? Not yet. We wanted to confirm our findings first, but Margaret, there's more. Robert's hands shook slightly as he turned to the next page of his report. The storm that's approaching, if we'd been dealing with this malfunction and severe turbulence, the perfect storm of catastrophe became clear in her mind. A plane with compromised hydraulic systems trying to navigate through violent weather conditions. She thought of the children she'd seen boarding, excited for their Florida vacation. The elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. The nervous first-time flyers clutching their boarding passes like lucky talismans. She understood now why her instincts had felt so urgent at the gate. Years of experience had somehow alerted her to a danger her mind hadn't yet fully comprehended. The strict adherence to safety protocols that Thomas Crawford had mocked as incompetent delay tactics had been the invisible hand of Providence. The weather radar in the maintenance office showed a churning mass of red and yellow, indicating severe thunderstorms with dangerous wind shear conditions. Lightning flickered across the screen with increasing frequency. Weather reports were being upgraded from warnings to emergency alerts. Margaret checked her watch. 42 minutes had passed since the first maintenance concerns were raised. Under normal circumstances, they would have been pushing back from the gate by now. Flight 747 would have been climbing through 10,000 feet, right into the path of the approaching storm system, with critically compromised hydraulic controls. Her radio crackled to life. "Margaret, this is James again. We're seeing wind speeds at 200 feet of nearly 40 knots and increasing. We need to initiate full emergency shutdown procedures for the entire terminal." Around her, the airport's rhythm began to change. Ground crews moved with increased urgency. Pilots huddled over weather charts in the crew lounges. Passengers paused in their shopping and dining, sensing something unusual in the air. The happy chaos of holiday travel was transforming into something more serious. Margaret pulled out her radio. "All departments, this is Margaret Thompson. Initiate Code Yellow protocols. We have incoming severe weather and a grounded aircraft with critical maintenance issues. I repeat, Code Yellow protocols are now in effect." The end. The emergency response system hummed to life as Margaret initiated the protocols she had personally helped develop 5 years earlier. Red lights began flashing in key operational areas, and pre-recorded announcements echoed through the terminal speakers. Ground staff hurried to their assigned emergency stations, while passengers watched with growing concern. Robert Harrison, the airport general manager, arrived at the operations center with his characteristic long strides. His silver hair and tailored suit projected authority as he surveyed the situation, spreading across multiple monitors. Margaret was already at the central command desk, surrounded by clipboard-wielding staff members and rapidly printing weather reports. "Margaret, what's the current status?" Robert asked, though his expression showed he already understood the gravity of the situation. "Sir, we have 2 critical issues converging. Flight 747 has severe hydraulic system failures that would have made catastrophic in-flight failure almost certain. At the same time, we have a supercell thunderstorm approaching at unprecedented speed, with tornado potential." Margaret spoke rapidly but clearly, showing him the weather radar images and maintenance photographs. Robert studied the data, his face growing more serious with each passing second. "Margaret, shutting down an entire terminal impacts thousands of passengers and costs the airport tremendous revenue. Are you absolutely certain this level of response is necessary?" Margaret felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She thought about the hundreds of lives aboard Flight 747, the staff members working the emergency procedures, and the thousands of passengers in the terminal. She remembered how just an hour ago her authority had been questioned in front of everyone. "Sir, with respect, the meteorological data shows this storm will hit in approximately 35 minutes. The wind shear alone could flip aircraft on the ground. The possible tornado formation could devastate our facilities. And we have a commercial airliner that could have experienced total hydraulic failure mid-flight." Her voice remained steady, despite the magnitude of what she was describing. "But the financial implications," Robert began, his mind clearly calculating. "The costs of delayed flights, stranded passengers, and emergency protocols." Margaret stepped closer, looking directly at the general manager. "Sir, with all due respect, we're talking about hundreds of lives. No amount of money can replace them. Every passenger on Flight 747 could have died. Every person in this terminal could be at risk if this storm hits us unprepared." Robert held her gaze for a long moment. Around them, other supervisors and department heads had gathered, quietly watching this exchange. These were people Margaret had worked with for years, some of whom had witnessed her earlier humiliation. Now they listened intently as she stood, her ground against one of the most powerful figures in British airport management. "Your hands are shaking, Margaret," Robert observed. "Yes, sir, they are, because I've never been more certain about a decision in my entire career." Her trembling fingers continued to adjust radio frequencies and coordinate emergency responses even as she spoke. The operations center buzzed with urgent activity. David Peterson entered the room, looking confused and uncertain. When he saw Margaret, commanding the emergency response, his surprise was evident. Thomas Crawford appeared at the edge of the crowd, having been evacuated from Gate 12. His earlier anger had transformed into genuine fear as he watched the storm footage on the monitors. "Everyone to your designated emergency positions," Margaret commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had trained for exactly this moment. "Terminal 2 shutdown begins in 20 minutes. All ground crew report to stations immediately." Staff members scattered to their roles. Pilots rushed to secure aircraft. Ground crew hustled to move luggage handling equipment indoors. Maintenance workers double-checked hangar doors and drainage systems. Each person moved with purpose, following procedures that Margaret had helped refine. Passenger services initiate evacuation protocols for all passengers in the affected terminals. Move them to secure areas in Terminal 1. Priority sequence: elderly, families with young children, passengers with special needs. Margaret's commands flowed like a well-rehearsed symphony. Through the operations center windows, they could see the storm approaching. Dark clouds rolled across the sky like an angry ocean wave. Lightning flickered with increasing frequency. The wind had picked up dramatically, causing loose objects to dance across the tarmac. Robert Harrison made his decision. "All department heads, follow Margaret's emergency protocols exactly as written. Full shutdown of Terminal 2 authorized." He turned to Margaret. "You're in command of this operation." Other supervisors nodded with respect. Even David Peterson looked at her with newfound admiration. In this moment of crisis, professional competence mattered more than any earlier disagreements or prejudices. A young trainee supervisor approached Margaret hesitantly. "Ms. Thompson, what about the international arrivals? We have planes coming in from New York that are already in the air. Contact air traffic control. They'll need to divert those flights to alternate airports. Our priority is securing what's already on the ground." Margaret consulted her emergency manual while simultaneously directing multiple ongoing operations. The massive terminal transformation was underway. Shops pulled down their security gates. Restaurants packed away loose furniture. Airlines scrambled to accommodate thousands of displaced passengers. The airport that had been buzzing with holiday cheer now moved with military precision toward emergency readiness. The end. The evacuation proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Margaret had spent countless hours refining these emergency protocols, and now her careful planning proved invaluable. Airport staff moved through the terminals with practiced precision, guiding passengers to designated safe zones. Elderly travelers received priority assistance, while families with young children followed clearly marked evacuation routes. The storm struck with terrifying power. Outside the terminal windows, nature unleashed its full fury. Lightning bolts split the sky in brilliant flashes, illuminating the darkened afternoon like daylight. Torrential rain pounded against the glass with such force that it sounded like thousands of pebbles being thrown. The wind howled like a wild animal, rattling windows and causing overhead signs to sway dangerously. Inside Terminal 1, where passengers had been relocated, the atmosphere was tense but orderly. People huddled in waiting areas, watching the storm. Through the windows with a mixture of fear and fascination. Children pressed their faces against the glass, while parents held them close. Business travelers abandoned their laptops to watch the spectacle outside. Thomas Crawford stood near the operations desk, watching the maintenance crew work on Flight 747 through the terminal windows. Under floodlights, technicians pointed to various parts of the aircraft's undercarriage, where bright red hydraulic fluid continued to drip onto the wet tarmac. The maintenance chief held up equipment that showed complete system failure in multiple redundant systems. As the reality of what had been prevented sank in, the color drained from Thomas's face. His earlier anger evaporated, replaced by a profound realization. He had seen enough aviation accident documentaries to understand what a complete hydraulic failure meant at cruising altitude. 300 passengers, including himself, had been saved by the very delay he had so angrily protested. Moving through the crowd, Thomas searched for Margaret. He found her at the emergency coordination desk, surrounded by monitors and radio equipment. She was directing operations with calm authority, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Gone was any trace of the woman who had been humiliated at the gate. This was a professional at the height of her powers. "Miss Thompson," Thomas approached, hesitantly. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his confidence shattered. I need to speak with you." Margaret looked up from her coordination charts. Her expression remained professional but gentled slightly as she recognized him. "Yes, Mr. Crawford, how can I help you?" "I owe you an apology," Thomas said quietly, struggling to find the right words. "If we had taken off when scheduled, if you hadn't insisted on that delay." His voice trailed off as the magnitude of what might have happened overwhelmed him. Margaret set down her clipboard and gave him her full attention. "Sir, I'm just glad everyone is safe. That's what matters most." "No," Thomas insisted. "I was completely wrong about everything. I questioned your competence, your authority, even other things I'm ashamed to admit. But you saved hundreds of lives tonight, including mine." Around them, other passengers who had been part of the earlier confrontation watched quietly. Some had recorded the exchange on their phones, and now they understood the significance of Margaret's insistence on safety protocols. The storm raged throughout the night, but by morning the worst had passed. As dawn broke over Manchester, the full extent of the near disaster became clear. Media crews gathered outside the airport as details emerged about both the averted hydraulic failure and the severe weather emergency. Headlines across national newspapers proclaimed, "Airport hero saves hundreds" and "Ground operations supervisor prevents aviation disaster." Television news led with Margaret's story, highlighting how her expertise and adherence to safety procedures had prevented a catastrophe. The airline's CEO, William Bennett, arrived at Heathrow Terminal 2 personally. He found Margaret at her usual morning station preparing for the day's flights. "Ms. Thompson," he said, extending his hand, "on behalf of the entire airline, I want to thank you. Your actions last night saved countless lives and potentially prevented the worst disaster in British aviation history." David Peterson stood nearby, having requested to speak with Margaret privately. "I've spent all night thinking about yesterday," he began, his usual managerial confidence replaced with genuine remorse. "I should have trusted your judgment. I let a passenger's complaint override 15 years of your exemplary service. That was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry." The apology was genuine, and Margaret appreciated it. But more importantly, something had fundamentally shifted in the airport's atmosphere. The following week, Margaret noticed countless small changes. Colleagues who had previously offered only polite nods now actively sought her advice on various operational matters. Junior staff members asked to shadow her during their shifts, hoping to learn from her expertise. Passengers who might once have questioned her authority now listened attentively when she explained procedures or safety measures. At the morning briefing, her fellow supervisors applauded as she entered the room. New safety protocols were renamed Thompson's Guidelines in recognition of her contributions. The employee bulletin board featured her photograph alongside a commendation from the Civil Aviation Authority. On a particularly busy Monday morning, as Margaret welcomed passengers for the day's first flights, a young girl approached her with her mother. "Are you the lady who saved all those people?" the child asked, her eyes wide with admiration. Margaret smiled warmly, kneeling to the child's level. "I just did my job, sweetheart, but thank you." As the family moved toward their gate, Margaret straightened her uniform jacket and looked out at the bustling terminal. She had proven something that transcended professional validation, that competence knows no color and courage speaks louder than prejudice. The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows as life at the airport returned to its normal rhythm. Margaret smiled to herself, understanding a profound truth that experience had taught her. Sometimes our darkest moments become the stage for our brightest triumphs. Universal message of hope. When we stand firm in our principles and remain committed to doing what's right, truth and justice will eventually prevail. Every professional, regardless of their background, deserves respect for their expertise and dedication to keeping others safe. The courage to maintain integrity in the face of adversity often leads to the most meaningful victories. The end.